Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about a movie that has a lot to talk about. Deadpool and Wolverine just hit theaters. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So do you remember all those daydreams I think all of us had as kids? We're kind of unbound by any adult notion of temperance or wisdom. We'd all imagine the things that we would be able to do once we grew up, such as eat ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or all-night video game sessions, or just eating a gluttonous amount of candy. Well, Deadpool and Wolverine is essentially the comic book movie equivalent of those kind of childhood fantasies. It's a film that's just defined by kind of an indulgence and kind of unrestrained excess. I think spoon-feeding audience is just a gratuitous amount of fan service and just R-rated raunchiness. Which is not to say that it's not also entertaining at times. And I think there are several moments in this that this seems like guaranteed to excite. There's a whole bunch of comic book geeks. But there is a reason why I think most of us never did fulfill those kind of juvenile dreams once we had the adult, liberty to do so. I think sometimes too much is, in fact, too much, and just an overindulgence in junk food is never as satisfying as it promises. So Deadpool and Wolverine is Deadpool's third film, if we all just pretend that the X-Men Origins Wolverine movie just never happened. But this is the first one of the Deadpool stories to fly under the Disney banner. And really his introduction into the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, did pose a dilemma for Disney, whether they would kind of maintain the established, R-rated raunchy template of the Fox versions, or if they would reimagine the character in, a more sanitized iteration. Well, the opening scene was just a profusion of graphic violence and blood, like literally splattering onto the screen, kind of announces right off the get-go, which direction Disney elected to go. And I think there are traces of what this film maybe could have been with a more like traditional PG-13 code of MCU paint. I think it could have worked. At the same time, it does become quickly kind of clear that really the obscenity in this movie is the point, that this is a movie that is sort of being profane for the sake of being profane. And despite some scattered moments of sort of attempted heartfelt, character moments, most of which belong to Hugh Jackman, who does slip effortlessly back into his iconic role as Wolverine. Kind of despite those moments, the overall plot in this has about as much like depth as maybe like a soggy piece of paper. There's some mumbo jumbo kind of science, talk about collapsing timelines, which leads Deadpool to seek out a Wolverine from a different universe, and kind of only for both of them to get trapped in a place called the Void, which is sort of like a quasi, like a meta universe where comic book movie characters across history of the genre have sort of been discarded and the ideas, get dumped. But none of it really matters. I think the plot is mostly an afterthought in this, kind of a mere necessity in order to string together sort of the endless barrage of jokes and spectacle and just sort of fan service, cameos. I think kind of as like the scenes transition almost jarringly from one to the other, can feel more like, a lineup of SNL sketches rather than being propelled forward by any kind of narrative unity. This movie is more like a loosely connected series of moments than it is like an actual movie with a cohesive plot. Even so, I'll say if you can sludge through the barrage of F-bombs and sex jokes and gratuitous violence, there are some moments that are effectively entertaining. To start, this movie has it's a banging soundtrack that is very well utilized within the movie. I think many of the jokes are very crash and I think personally found distasteful, but plenty of them are also legitimately funny and laugh out loud hilarious. I think the action scenes too may largely be kind of empty spectacle without any real stakes to them, but many of them are also thrilling and inventive. For example, there's a very cleverly choreographed fight which takes place almost exclusively inside of a vehicle, and there's another one near the end of this movie, kind of the standout action scene that features a very long, unbroken tracking shot as Deadpool and Wolverine kind of brawl their way across the screen, this through a mob of opponents, and it is just very exciting. And the same is true for the fan service in this, because this movie features almost an unwieldy number of cameos and comic book Easter eggs. I won't spoil any of them here, obviously, but it is incredible that these surprises weren't leaked out to the public before the release, and really as unexpected cameo after unexpected cameo, paraded across the screen. There were audible cheers in my theater, and those cheers might be the best embodiment, I think, of what this film is, and maybe what this film isn't. Because this is a movie that attempts to give audiences, I think, exactly what they want, allowing them to indulge in just some of that fun nostalgia, even if they are, largely like empty calorie delights. Does the fan service always make sense for the plot? Probably not, but I think that is beside the point for this. I think this movie is all about sort of those immediate moments of excitement and kind of moving briskly from one to the next. Although, ironically, I think despite all the the statements that were made on the press tour, like the marketing for this movie, about how they were bucking the recent Marvel trend of shared universes and interconnectivity, and that this would instead be a movie that you could just simply enjoy without feeling like you have to go do a bunch of homework and watch a bunch of other movies, beforehand. And kind of despite that, I'm hard pressed to think of another comic book movie that relies as heavily on like knowledge and like affinity toward like prior films, and even just awareness of like deeper cuts of unrealized fan casting in the past, or like real world behind the scenes studio drama. I can imagine someone watching this movie for the first time, maybe like 20 years from now, and just being totally bewildered as all the sort of the references and the meta jokes just totally go over their head. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, oh boy, there is a lot of content. Usually I try and break it down, each sort of thing to be aware of, but there's just too much for this. So just to paint with maybe a broader brush, give you an idea of what is in this. As far as language, again, too many to specific to count, but there are at least over 100 F-bombs in this, as well as just a barrage of other profanities and crude words in almost every scene of dialogue, as well as like the names of God and Jesus and Christ are all used each multiple times, kind of abused as well. And there's also just plenty of violence in this, very graphically depicted violence, as heads explode and like a splattering of gore, or one character has his skin pulled completely off and you sort of see the blood and the muscles and things underneath, and just countless sort of goons and bad guys that get stabbed or cut with blades, and oftentimes like in the head or even like in the crotch or the butt. As far as sexuality, there is no like nudity or sex scene. I don't know, perhaps that's where like Disney just sort of put their foot down and said we're not going to have that. Although there are some brief flashbacks that include reminders of sex scenes from some of the earlier Deadpool films. But beyond that, there's just a lot of other sexual references and things going on. And there's representation from really a wide range of just all the different sexual orientations. You have gay and lesbian and transgender and, bisexual, as well as just an abundance of crude sexual language and humor, including jokes that focus on like prostitution and masturbation, and even some that, touch on like sexual abuse of children, and a few other just content things that particularly I think Christians will want to be aware of, is that there is a repeated gag where Deadpool refers to himself as Marvel Jesus and sees himself as sort of a quasi savior, referencing his desire to gather disciples, and kind of making statements about himself, that he has risen when he survives a near death encounter. Again, one other thing is that there is sort of drug use, or at least reference to drug use, and kind of about cocaine becomes a recurrent gag. As far as themes and worldview and this thing's going on beneath the surface of this, despite jokes, from Deadpool about being Marvel Jesus, this film is not bursting with many like religious themes. Although, and despite featuring, I think, two traditionally like anti-heroes, it does explore sort of the noble nature of heroism. Because at the start of this film, Deadpool desires to join the Avengers, become one of Earth's mightiest heroes, but he is rejected in his job interview because of what he's told is like misplaced motivations, where he wants to be a mighty hero because he needs it, but he is told that true selfless heroes do so because others need them. And it kind of explores the question of, is a hero still a hero if they do good things, but for the wrong reasons? And I think it is an interesting question to explore, and one that does have relevance beyond the realm of like superpowered beings. And you can see that even just in recent years with kind of the rise of internet personalities and influencers that have built platforms by doing like outwardly decent acts, such as feeding the homeless or helping the poor, but doing so while on camera for the sake of new content for their own monetized YouTube channel, which has caused many people to question sort of like the true virtue of those acts. And I think the question is relevant for the church as well, because Jesus said, but when you give to the needy or perform an act of kindness, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving or your act of kindness may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you, which is Matthew 6, 2 to 4. And as Christians, we are called to do good deeds, but we're called to do so for the good of others, our neighbor, and for the glory of God, not just to satisfy our own ego or to cultivate like an outwardly, righteous public persona. And by the end of this film, both Deadpool and Wolverine have learned like that true nature of heroism and are willing to sacrifice their own interest, even their own lives, to put the good of others before their own. And there may not be a whole lot else in Deadpool and Wolverine that Christians will want to take to heart, but at least that lesson can be affirmed, and I think even better yet, can be embraced and put into action. So in the end, Deadpool and Wolverine really relies on just a torrent of like shock jock humor and kind of nostalgic, Greek exciting jolts to distract from I think just how hollow and meaningless, the overall movie is. I'm sure there will be viewers that enjoy this. I think many people will enjoy this movie. I think there will be some that also praise it for being, a comic book movie made for adults. And obviously, in one sense, that is very much true, as I think younger viewers should stay far away from this film. At the same time, there's just something almost juvenile about the experience of this film that's just saturated with raunchy jokes and foul language and shocking violence and just, tons and tons of fan service. I think wish fulfillment sounds fun, but hey, there's a reason that I never did fulfill my childhood dream of eating juice concentrate with a spoon. I think sometimes getting what you want isn't always as satisfying as we imagined it to be. But hey, I would love to hear your thoughts. I think this is a movie that people are going to have different opinions on. I think a lot of Christians are going to hate this. Some Christians are going to want to defend this or enjoy it, or hey, maybe you fall somewhere in the middle. So be polite, but jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Lots of movie reviews and our faith and pop culture podcast every Thursday, and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.